Hello, and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Picture a military tent on the frozen banks of the Danube River in the year 178. Outside, snow falls on the corpse fires of a Roman army camp, devastated by plague. Germanic war drums echo across the black water. Inside the command tent, by the flickering light of a single oil lamp, the most powerful man on earth bends over a wax tablet, carefully inscribing words in Greek. Not battle plans, not imperial edicts, philosophy. This is Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, master of the known world, writing what would become history's most influential meditation on how to live with dignity in the face of chaos. While his soldiers die of disease, while barbarian armies mass for dawn attacks, while his empire struggles with famine and rebellion, he writes, "At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being." The scene defies every expectation we have of absolute power. Here is a man who commands 44 legions, who rules from the Scottish Highlands to the Sahara Desert, from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf. He could be in Rome, reclining in marble baths, watching gladiators die for his amusement. Instead, he has spent the last decade of his life in these fated frontier camps, personally leading campaigns against enemies who decapitate their prisoners and drink from their skulls. And in the brief hours between battles and military councils, he writes notes to himself about virtue, duty, and the proper way to face death. The plague that ravages his camp is the same one that has killed 5 million subjects across his empire, possibly including his own brother and co-emperor. His personal physician, Galen, fled Rome rather than face it. The disease, probably smallpox, turns men into walking horrors. First comes the fever that makes soldiers tear off their armour in sub-zero temperatures, then the pustules that cover the body like scales. The stench of rotting flesh fills the camp. Men who survive Germanic spears die choking on their own blood. Marcus has watched this happen thousands of times. He has held the hands of dying soldiers half his age. He knows he will likely die of the same disease, yet his response is not despair or rage or the desperate pleasures that so many of his predecessors sought. His response is to write with painstaking care thoughts like this: "Remember that very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself and your way of thinking." These are not words meant for publication or posterity. They're private notes titled simply to himself, written in Greek because that was the language of philosophy, not Latin, the language of power. The barbarians gathering across the river are not the disorganized rebel Roman propaganda described. The Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Aes, these are sophisticated warrior cultures with complex battle tactics and iron discipline. They have studied Roman warfare for generations. They know the emperor is sick, aging, exhausted. They know his son Commodus is a vain fool more interested in gladiatorial games than governance. They smell weakness. They are right to. This is an empire stretched to its breaking point, held together by the will of one increasingly frail philosopher who never wanted to rule in the first place. This impossible scene, the dying emperor-philosopher writing Greek ethics while his world burns, is not just a curious historical anecdote. It is the defining image of one of history's most extraordinary experiments. What happens when absolute power falls into the hands of a man who genuinely doesn't want it? What becomes of an empire when its ruler cares more about being good than being great? Tonight we'll uncover how a bookish Roman aristocrat became the most powerful man on earth, and why at the peak of crisis he turned not to violence or tyranny, but to the ancient wisdom of Greek philosophy. The answer reveals not just the character of Marcus Aurelius, but the very nature of power duty and what it means to live with dignity in an undignified world. But to understand the emperor in the tent, we must first meet the boy who would have been perfectly happy never to wear the purple at all. In the year wonders Pentis, Emperor Hadrian attended a ceremony at the Roman Forum when he noticed something peculiar. A 6-year-old boy from the senatorial class had just dropped a ceremonial tablet during a religious procession. While the other patrician children scrambled to pretend nothing had happened, this boy stopped, picked up the tablet, and loudly announced his mistake to the entire assembly. When the priest moved to quietly dismiss the error, the child insisted on performing the ritual penance. Despite the laughter of the crowd, Hadrian leaned forward on his throne. "Who is that boy?" he asked. "Marcus Annus Verus Caesar," came the reply, "the grandson of the consul." This was not a child destined for the throne. His family, while distinguished, stood several rings removed from imperial power. The Anivi were that comfortable species of Roman nobility who had wealth without the dangerous proximity to the purple that so often proved fatal in imperial politics. Young Marcus's father had died when the boy was 3, leaving him to be raised in the traditional Roman manner by his grandfather, also named Marcus Annus Varus. The elder was a man of the old Republic virtues, austere, disciplined, more interested in duty than glory. His villa on the hill was known not for its opulence, but for its library. It was in this library that the boy revealed his strange nature. While other aristocratic children played at being gladiators, or staged mock naval battles in the garden pools, Marcus could be found reading Cato or attempting to pass the Greek of Plato's dialogues, running his small finger under each word. His mother, Dicia Lucilla, one of the wealthiest women in Rome, would find him asleep on the marble floor beside his bed, having decided that soft mattresses made the mind weak. He was 8 years old. Hadrian, that most Greek of Roman emperors, found himself increasingly fascinated by this peculiar child. He began inviting the boy to imperial gatherings, where Marcus's behaviour continued to astonish. During a feast where Hadrian tested his courtiers with philosophical riddles, the emperor asked young Marcus whether he would rather be wealthy or wise. Without hesitation, the boy replied, "Wise, Caesar, for wealth can be lost in a day, but what you understand remains yours forever." When Hadrian, amused, asked what the boy understood, Marcus replied, "Very little, which is why I read so much." The emperor began calling him Verissimus, the most truthful one. It was more than a pet name. It was a recognition of something extraordinary. In a court where every word was calculated, where children were taught from birth to flatter and dissemble, here was a boy who seemed incapable of deception. When Hadrian once asked him what he thought of the palace, expecting the usual praise, Marcus replied that it was very beautiful, but that he preferred his grandfather's house because there are fewer people watching you think. This honesty was not naivety. The boy understood the cost of truth. His grandfather had warned him that honest men often died young in Rome, but Marcus had already developed through his voracious reading and natural disposition the beginnings of a philosophical framework. He kept a journal written in a careful child's hand where he recorded not events but thoughts. "Today I was angry at my pedagogue. Why? Because he corrected me. But isn't correction a gift?" These were not the thoughts of a typical Roman child. By the time Marcus was 15, Hadrian was dying and the succession loomed. The emperor had no sons. His first choice for heir had died. His second choice, Lucius Aelius, had also died suddenly. Hadrian needed someone he could trust to bridge the gap to the next generation. His eyes fell upon Antoninus, a respected senator with no sons of his own. But there was a condition attached to this adoption, one that would change the course of history. The dying emperor's plan would place the truthful boy directly in line for a throne he had never sought. The moment Hadrian's adoption plan became public, 12 tutors descended upon 17-year-old Marcus Annus Verus like an occupying army. The boy who had chosen to sleep on floors would now be reshaped, moulded, transformed into an instrument of empire. But what happened next was one of the most extraordinary educational experiments in history, an attempt to create not just a ruler, but a philosopher king. The first to arrive was Diognetus, who taught Marcus something unexpected for a future emperor: how to paint. But Diognetus had a deeper purpose. "Look at this red pigment," he said one morning, grinding cinnabar in a mortar. "Men die mining this in Spain. It costs more than gold. Yet mixed with common clay, it becomes a muddy brown, the emperor's purple and a slave's blood. What is the real difference?" Through art, he was teaching Marcus to see past surfaces, to understand that power and poverty were merely different colours, applied to the same human canvas. Then came Alexander of Kim for Greek grammar. But Alexander taught more than conjugations. He made Marcus translate the hardest passages of Homer, the ones where Achilles weeps for Patroclus, or Priam begs for his son's body. "You will sign death warrants," Alexander told him bluntly. "Remember that even your enemies are someone's beloved son." Marcus spent entire nights parsing Greek texts, not because he needed the language. All educated Romans spoke Greek, but because Alexander insisted that struggling with foreign syntax taught the mind to see familiar problems from unfamiliar angles. The most demanding was Herodotus, the legendary Greek orator whose wealth rivaled the imperial treasury. Herodes would make Marcus deliver the same speech 50 times, each time to a different imaginary audience: senators, soldiers, grieving mothers, German barbarians. "Words are weapons," Herodes thundered when Marcus complained of the repetition. "A misplaced phrase can start a civil war. A perfect sentence can prevent one." He forced Marcus to argue both sides of impossible cases. Should Rome burn its own grain supplies to prevent an approaching enemy from seizing them? Is it just to execute 10 innocent men if it saves 1,000? These were not academic exercises. They were rehearsals for decisions that would one day cost lives. But the teacher who truly revolutionized Marcus's mind was Quintus Junius Rusticus. Rusticus had studied under Epictetus, the former slave who had become Stoicism's greatest teacher. On their first meeting, Rusticus handed Marcus a worn scroll. "This is Epictetus's discourses," he said. "Your rank means nothing. Your wealth means nothing. You control only your choices and your responses. Everything else, including the empire you will one day rule, is merely on loan from fortune." Rusticus's lessons were brutal in their simplicity. When Marcus complained about an incompetent servant, Rusticus asked, "Are you angry at the servant or at your expectation that all servants should be competent?" When Marcus fell ill and cursed his fever, Rusticus sat by his bed. "The fever is not in your control. Your response to the fever is, which one deserves your attention?" He taught Marcus to examine every emotional reaction like a scientist studying a specimen. Anger, fear, desire. These were not feelings to be suppressed, but phenomena to be understood. The most famous of his tutors was Marcus Cornelius Fronto, the greatest Latin orator of the age. Their relationship would produce hundreds of letters that survived, revealing an intimacy rare between Roman men. Fronto taught Marcus the architecture of persuasion, but more importantly he taught him intellectual humility. "I am teaching you to be eloquent," Fronto wrote, "so that you can express truth clearly, not so you can make lies beautiful." When Marcus began favouring philosophy over rhetoric, Fronto was heartbroken, but continued teaching, understanding that his student was becoming something greater than an orator. These men were not creating a scholar. They were forging a new kind of ruler, one who would view the throne not as a prize, but as a burden to be carried with philosophical discipline. Each teacher left his mark, creating internal tensions that would define Marcus's entire life. The education was working too well. Marcus was becoming exactly what Hadrian had envisioned, a philosopher prince. There was just one problem. The more Marcus learned about wisdom and virtue, the less he wanted the power that was inexorably coming his way. On February 25th, 138 AD, 19-year-old Marcus Annus Verus stood in the Senate house and felt his life end. Not literally, he would live another 42 years. But the young man who dreamed of philosophical contemplation in a quiet villa died the moment Antoninus Pius, following Hadrian's deathbed command, spoke the formal words of adoption. "From this day, you are Marcus Aulus Aurelius Varus Caesar." The senators erupted in rehearsed congratulations. Marcus stood frozen, the new name hanging around his neck like an iron collar. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He walked the corridors of his family's villa. Soon, he would be forced to move to the imperial palace, and found himself in the library where he had spent his happiest hours. His journals from that period survive, and they reveal a young man in psychological agony. "They have given me a purple cloak," he wrote, "but taken away my freedom to think without consequence. Every word I speak will now be law. Every mistake I make will be written in blood." The adoption meant more than a new name and future throne. It meant immediate practical changes that horrified the philosophical young man. He was now engaged to Faustina, Antoninus's daughter, his own cousin whom he barely knew. His previous engagement to Sionia Fabia was dissolved with bureaucratic efficiency. He watched the girl he'd grown fond of married off to another man within weeks. "Even my affections," he wrote to Fonto, "are now property of the state." The physical transformation was equally jarring. Palace slaves arrived at dawn to dress him in the heavy toga with a purple stripe that marked him as Caesar. The wool dyed with the secretions of thousands of merc snails was worth more than a house. It itched terribly. Marcus, who had chosen to wear rough tunics as a philosophical exercise, now stood before mirrors while attendants adjusted every fold. He was forbidden to walk anywhere without lichas, ceremonial bodyguards whose real job was to ensure everyone knew that imperial power was passing by. Privacy vanished overnight. His philosophical mentor, Rusticus, found him one evening attempting to study Epictetus, while 3 secretaries hovered nearby, ready to record any casual observation as potential imperial policy. "I am trying to read about freedom," Marcus said bitterly. While I cannot even dismiss these men without causing a political incident, Rusticus's response was harsh but necessary. "Then your philosophy begins now, not in contemplating ideal virtue, but in practicing it while wearing chains." The Senate meetings were the worst torture. Marcus was required to attend every session, sitting on a special platform where everyone could observe the future emperor's reactions. He watched senators who had treated him with casual friendliness now approach with calculated deference. Men twice his age prostrated themselves before him. One senator, who had once lectured him about Stoic simplicity, arrived wearing jewels worth a year's tribute from Syria. The hypocrisy made Marcus physically ill. He developed stomach problems that would plague him his entire life. But the most crushing weight was the knowledge itself, the terrible certainty of what was coming. Antoninus was already 61 when he adopted Marcus. Every morning Marcus woke knowing that someday, perhaps soon, a freed man would shake him awake with the words every heir dreaded and desired. "Caesar is dead. You are Caesar." He would inherit not just palaces and legions, but the responsibility for 50 million souls. Every famine would be his failure. Every war would bear his name. Every plague victim. Every murdered slave. Every starving child in the empire's vast expanse would be in some cosmic sense his personal responsibility. One night, unable to bear the palace walls, Marcus escaped his guards and walked to the Tiber. Standing on the bank where Rome's unwanted infants were routinely abandoned, he seriously contemplated running away to Athens, perhaps where he could study philosophy and anonymity. But then he remembered his grandfather's words. A Roman's first duty is to roam. The stoicism he loved taught that we must accept our fate, not flee from it. If the universe had decided he would be emperor, then refusing would be the ultimate philosophical failure. He walked back to the palace as dawn broke over the 7 hills, accepting a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. But Antoninus Pass would prove to be more than just his adoptive father. He would become Marcus's 23-year education in the practical art of managing an empire without losing one's soul. For 23 years, Marcus Aurelius lived in the strangest prison ever devised. He was emperor in everything but name, wielding vast authority while bearing no final responsibility. Every morning, from 138 to 161, he would rise before dawn in the imperial palace and walk to Antoninus Pius's study, where the actual emperor was already working by lamplight, reading dispatches from Britain about tribal raids or reviewing tax records from Egyptian grain shipments. "Good morning, my son," Antoninus would say without looking up. "Today you will learn why emperors die young." But Antoninus Pius didn't die young. At 61, when he took power, this careful, methodical man would rule for 23 years of unprecedented peace. He fought no major wars, conquered no new territories, built no colossal monuments to himself. Instead, he did something far more difficult. He maintained an empire stretching across 3 continents without crisis, without purges, without the spectacular cruelties that had defined so many of his predecessors. And beside him, every day sat Marcus, absorbing lessons that no philosophy book could teach. The education was ruthlessly practical. Antoninus made Marcus sit through endless legal proceedings, listening to disputes about water rights between Syrian villages or inheritance claims from GIC merchants. "Philosophy tells you justice exists," Antoninus observed during a particularly tedious case about sheep theft in Macedonia. "I'm teaching you what justice costs. Hours of listening to liars argue about things that don't matter to you but define their entire world." Marcus learned to stay awake through 8-hour Senate debates about harbour fees, to remember the names of hundreds of provincial administrators, to calculate grain distributions for cities he would never see. In 145, Marcus married Fina the Younger as arranged. She was 15, he was 24, and their wedding was the most elaborate spectacle Rome had seen in decades. 40,000 spectators received free bread and wine. Gladiators died in the arena for their entertainment. Marcus stood through it all in purple silk that made him sweat, thinking of Epictetus's words about accepting what fate assigns. But then something unexpected happened. He fell genuinely in love with his arranged bride. Fanina was intelligent, sharp-tongued, and utterly unimpressed by his philosophical pretensions. "You quote dead Greeks while live Romans need governing," she told him, after finding him reading instead of reviewing provincial appointments. She would give him 13 children and challenge him intellectually for 30 years. The palace routine became his monastic discipline. Wake at dawn for philosophy, morning council with Antoninus, afternoon in the law courts, evening with Faustina and their growing family. Then, when the palace finally quieted, Marcus would light his lamp and return to his true passion, his philosophical notebooks. But now these entries had a different character. Instead of abstract musings about virtue, he wrote about applying stoicism to specific problems. How to remain calm when a senator lies to your face, how to forgive a freedman who steals, how to love a child you know will probably die. Childhood mortality claimed 6 of his 13 offspring. Antoninus, despite having no interest in philosophy himself, protected Marcus's studies with fierce devotion. When senators mocked the heir's bookishness, Antoninus reminded them that Hadrian had chosen this path. When Marcus wanted to attend philosophy lectures instead of gladiatorial games, Antoninus publicly accompanied him, making intellectual pursuit fashionable. "I'm giving you something precious," Antoninus told him once. "Time to become yourself before you must become Rome." The empire during these years experienced its last golden breath. Trade flowed freely from Scotland to the Sahara. The Parthians remained quiet on the eastern frontier. The German tribes stayed beyond the Rhine and Danube. Cities grew rich. Laws were reformed. It was the apex of ancient civilization and completely unsustainable. Marcus sensed this. In his journals from this period, between notes on Stoic ethics appear worried observations. The plague in Syria spreads westward. The Germanic tribes grow bold. Soldiers demand higher donatives. Storm clouds gathered at every horizon. In early 161, Antoninus fell ill with a fever. For 3 days the 74-year-old emperor refused to eat, speaking only to give Marcus final instructions about provincial governors and grain supplies. On March 7th, he called for the captain of the guard and spoke his last official words: "Go to the rising sun, I am already setting." That night, the longest imperial apprenticeship in Roman history ended. Marcus had spent 23 years preparing for a job he never wanted. He was about to discover that all those years of preparation had not prepared him for what was coming. The Senate had assembled before dawn on March 8th, 161, ready to grovel before their new absolute master, when Marcus Aurelius walked in and shattered 1,500 years of precedent with 5 words: "I will not rule alone." The silence that followed was so complete that senators could hear the morning rain hitting the bronze roof. Some thought they had misheard. Others wondered if the new emperor had lost his mind. The president of the Senate cleared his throat nervously. "Caesar, we have prepared the oath of allegiance to you as Augustus Impera." And Marcus raised his hand. "You will swear the same oath to my brother Lucius Verus. The empire will have 2 emperors equal in authority. No Roman emperor had ever voluntarily shared supreme power. Not Augustus, not Trajan, not even the divine Hadrian. Absolute power once grasped was never willingly divided. Lucius Verus was everything Marcus was not. 8 years younger at 30, he was tall where Marcus was average, athletic where Marcus was bookish, charming where Marcus was reserved. He kept his blonde hair long in defiance of Roman conservative fashion, spent fortunes on Arabian horses, and could drink provincial governors under the table while negotiating tax rates. While Marcus had spent the previous evening reading philosophy and preparing his inaugural address, Lucius had been at the races, winning 1,000 gold pieces, betting on a Spanish charioteer. When the messenger found him to announce that Marcus wanted him as co-emperor, Lucius reportedly laughed and asked if his brother had been drinking. But Marcus understood something the shocked senators didn't. The empire was too vast for one man to govern effectively. While Antoninus Pius had managed through an exceptional period of peace, Marcus had access to intelligence reports the Senate never saw. The Parthians were mobilizing in the east. Germanic tribes were confederating in the north. The plague creeping through Egypt would soon reach Rome. Britain was in revolt again. Marcus needed someone who could lead armies while he managed the state, someone who could charm foreign kings while he reformed laws. He needed Lucius. The private meeting between the brothers, recorded by the court historian, reveals the delicate negotiation. "You know I don't want this," Lucius said bluntly. "I want to race horses and drink good wine and sleep with beautiful women." Marcus replied, "And you can do all those things after you help me save the empire." They worked out a practical division. Marcus would handle internal administration, law and finance from Rome. Lucius would command the armies and manage foreign policy. Marcus would be the senior partner, but Lucius would have genuine autonomy. It was a solution born of philosophy meeting pragmatism. The Senate, once they recovered from shock, saw the political brilliance. By elevating Lucius, Marcus had prevented any ambitious general from using him as a rival claimant. He had given the armies a commander they could respect. Lucius genuinely enjoyed military life in ways the philosophical Marcus never could. Most cleverly, he had created a check on his own power, ensuring that his Stoic principles about authority would be tested daily by having to negotiate with an equal. Fina understood immediately what others missed. That night she found Marcus in his study, already deep in administrative scrolls. "You've made yourself accountable," she said. "Now you can't become a tyrant even if you wanted to." Marcus looked up, exhausted already on his first day as emperor. Plato wrote about philosopher kings. He never mentioned what happens when the philosopher realizes he needs help. The first test came within weeks. A group of senators approached Lucius secretly, suggesting that his brother's weakness had given him an opportunity. "Why share what you could take entirely?" they whispered. Lucius's response became legendary. He had the senators arrested, brought them before Marcus, and said publicly, "These men think we are like previous emperors, ready to murder each other for power. Show them they're wrong." Marcus pardoned them all. The message was clear. This partnership was genuine. But even as the two brothers were redefining imperial power, dispatches were arriving from the east with increasing urgency. The Parthian Empire, Rome's ancient enemy, had invaded Armenia. The governor of Cappadocia was dead, his legions routed. The greatest military crisis in 50 years was beginning, and the philosopher emperor's untested partnership would face immediate trial by fire. The severed head of Marcus Aurelius Severianus, Roman governor of Cappadocia, arrived in Rome preserved in honey. Its eyes replaced with garnets that caught the lamplight in the Senate chamber like drops of blood. King Vologaeus' Thor of Parthian had included a message written in gold ink on purple parchment. "Your empire ends where mine begins. Armenia is mine." Marcus Aurelius held the dispatch with steady hands, though witnesses noted his jaw tightening as he read. Severianus had taken his legion into Armenia against orders, seeking glory. The Parthians had surrounded them at Eliga. Rather than surrender, Severianus had killed himself. His entire legion, 6,000 men, had been slaughtered or enslaved. Their Aquila, the sacred eagle standard, was now decorating Volus's throne room in Tisiphon. This was not just a military defeat. It was a humiliation that could trigger revolts across the empire if not answered decisively. The war council that followed revealed the empire's frightening unpreparedness. 23 years of peace under Antoninus had left the Eastern Legion soft. Commanders had spent more time building villas than fortifications. The Syrian legions were notorious for their luxury. Soldiers who perfumed their hair and attended more theatre performances than combat drills. One senator suggested that Marcus himself should lead the campaign. The philosopher emperor's response was pragmatic. "I've never held a sword in anger. Would you have me learn generalship while Roman soldiers die for my education?" Instead, Marcus turned to Lucius. His younger co-emperor had been preparing to leave for a tour of the pleasure houses of Alexandria when the crisis struck. "Brother," Marcus said, finding him at a wine-soaked banquet. "The East needs you." Lucius sat down his cup, suddenly sober. "You're sending me to fight Parthians. I race chariots, Marcus. I don't conduct sieges." Marcus's reply revealed his strategic thinking. "No, I'm sending you to look like you're fighting Parthians. The generals will handle the actual war. The legions need to see an emperor in armour. You're remarkably good at appearances." The preparation was methodical. Marcus spent sleepless nights personally selecting the real commanders who would accompany Lucius. Statius Priscus, who had crushed rebellions in Britain, Avidius Cassius, a disciplinarian so harsh his own soldiers called him the Iron General, and Martius Verus, a logistics genius who could supply an army in the desert. Lucius would be the golden figurehead. They would be the steel beneath. While Lucius prepared for departure, receiving his ceremonial armour and purple field cloak, Marcus worked 18-hour days securing the resources for a massive eastern campaign. He emptied the treasury to recruit new legions, conscripting gladiators and even brigands with promises of citizenship. He negotiated with German tribes for auxiliary cavalry, offering them Roman gold to fight Rome's enemies. When senators complained about the cost, Marcus asked them coldly, "Would you prefer to negotiate the tribute Parthia will demand after they take Syria?" The farewell between the brothers was public theatre hiding private truth. Before thousands of citizens, Marcus embraced Lucius at the Milvian Bridge, declaring, "You carry Rome's honour to the east." But the night before, in private, he had been blunter. Drink less. Listen to Cassius. Don't get yourself killed doing something stupidly heroic. And for the love of all gods, don't start any unnecessary wars while you're there. Lucius had laughed. "You handle the Senate's tedium. I'll handle Parthia's arrows. We'll see who has the worst job." As Lucius's convoy departed, a spectacular procession of 30,000 soldiers, siege engines and supply wagons stretching for miles, Marcus returned to a palace that suddenly felt emptier. Within days, reports began arriving. Lucius had stopped in every major city along the route east, throwing magnificent games, distributing donations to soldiers, making himself beloved. He reached Antioch and immediately made it his headquarters, close enough to the front to claim command, but far enough to avoid actual danger. The generals, as Marcus had planned, began the real war. But the young philosopher emperor, managing his first military crisis from 1,000 miles away, was about to learn that some victories carry within them the seeds of catastrophe. The legions would indeed triumph in Parthia, but when they marched home in 166, they would bring with them an invisible enemy more devastating than any eastern army. A plague that would kill millions and transform Marcus from a peacetime philosopher into something he had never imagined becoming. The first soldier to die vomited blood onto the marble steps of the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, during Lucius Varus's triumph parade in October 166. The victorious legions had just marched through Rome's streets, displaying Parthian gold and enslaved princes when the young auxiliary from the 15th Legion collapsed, his skin erupting in pustules that burst like rotting fruit. Within 3 days, 40 soldiers from his cohort were dead. Within 3 weeks, bodies were being burned in Massae. The invisible enemy that rode home with the conquering army would kill more Romans than all of Parthia's arrows combined. Marcus Aurelius watched his empire begin to die from the palace balcony, where smoke from the corpse fires turned Roman sunsets a sickly orange. His physician, the great Galen, had fled to his estate in Asia Minor, claiming he needed to gather medicinal herbs, but really abandoning a plague he couldn't cure. Lesser doctors described symptoms that read like passages from the underworld. Fever so intense that victims tore off their skin trying to cool down. Pustules that covered the body like scales of a dragon. Throats that closed until breathing became a death rattle. The disease probably smallpox, though some historians argue for measles killed 1 in 4. It touched in Rome's crowded insul, where families of 10 lived in single rooms. It killed everyone. The emperor's response revealed both his philosophy and his desperation. While previous rulers might have fled to country estates, Marcus remained in Rome, personally visiting plague hospitals. His advisors begged him to leave. "Caesar, you cannot help the dead by joining them," one senator pleaded. Marcus replied by quoting his beloved Epictetus. What brings no benefit to the hive brings none to the bee. He established new burial grounds when the old ones overflowed, requisitioned private gardens as temporary morgues, and used imperial funds to provide free funerals for the poor. A radical act that prevented desperate families from hiding corpses in their homes. The economic catastrophe matched the human one. Trade routes emptied as merchants refused to enter infected cities. Farms went unharvested as rural populations fled or died. The price of grain increased tenfold. In the markets of the Subura, Romans fought with knives over mouldy bread. Military recruitment collapsed, not from cowardice, but simple mathematics. Entire villages that had supplied generations of legionaries were now silent graveyards. Marcus was forced to recruit gladiators and slaves, promising freedom for service, a decision that horrified traditionalist senators, but kept the frontiers defended. His personal losses mounted like steps to a scaffold. His newborn son, Annas, died first, lasting only days after birth. Then his daughter, Domitia Fina. His letters to Fonto from this period are almost unbearable to read. I held her while she burned with fever. She asked me why the gods were angry. What could I tell her? That there are no gods as the Epicureans claim, that the gods exist but don't care as some philosophers argue. I told her the gods test those they love most. She smiled and said, "Then they must love me very much." She died holding my hand. In January 169, Lucius Verus returned from another eastern campaign, this time against the Germans who had exploited Rome's weakness during the plague. The brothers met at Alinum near modern Venice. Witnesses described Lucius's gaunt, his famous golden hair now grey at 38. 3 days into their strategic discussions, Lucius collapsed in the bathhouse. Marcus found him convulsing, blood frothing from his mouth. "Brother," Lucius gasped, "I think your philosophy didn't prepare you for this." He died that night. Whether from plague or stroke, historians still debate. Marcus held his body and wept, the first time anyone had seen the emperor cry publicly. The plague burned through the empire for 15 years, killing between 5 and 10 million people, perhaps a quarter of the population. Entire legions vanished. Great cities became necropolises. The Roman army would never fully recover its pre-plague strength. Marcus, the philosopher who believed in providence and cosmic order, found himself ruling over an apocalypse that challenged every principle he held sacred. His private notebooks from this period show a man wrestling with despair. Either there is providence and this suffering has meaning, or we are alone in a universe of random cruelty. I must believe the former, or I could not rise each morning to face the pious. Yet even as he buried his brother and watched his empire burn with fever, worse news was arriving from the north. The Germanic tribes, sensing Rome's weakness like wolves scenting blood, were massing for an invasion that would define the remainder of Marcus's life. In the winter of 170, a Roman merchant travelling near Aquila stopped his wagon in confusion. The road ahead was filled with what looked like a moving forest. Then the forest resolved into men. Thousands upon thousands of Germanic warriors, their long hair caked with mud, their shields painted with serpents and wolves. The Maremomanian Quadi had done the impossible. They had crossed the frozen Danube, smashed through Rome's frontier defences and invaded Italy itself. For the first time in 300 years, barbarian armies stood on Italian soil. Marcus Aurelius received the news while judging a property dispute in the Forum. The messenger, having ridden 3 horses to death, collapsed at the emperor's feet and gasped out his message. "Caesar, Aquileia is besieged. They've burned Apurium, 20,000 warriors, perhaps more. The provincial armies are destroyed." The property disputants would later testify that Marcus went completely still like a statue for several heartbeats. Then he stood, removed his purple-bordered toga, and said quietly, Summon the war council and bring me armour that fits." The bitter truth was that Marcus had never commanded troops in battle. But 49 years old, he had spent his entire life in libraries and law courts. His hands, soft from holding styluses, had never gripped a cavalry sword. His knowledge of warfare came from reading Caesar's commentaries and Xenophon's accounts, not from standing in a shield wall while Germanic berserkers tried to split your skull. The Senate expected him to appoint a general. Instead, he announced he would lead the army personally. "An emperor who sends others to die while he remains safe," he said, "deserves neither empire nor safety." The preparation was almost comical in its desperation. Marcus spent his days in accelerated military training, learning to ride a warrior without falling off, practicing sword work with gladiators who were ordered not to hurt him, but also not to let him win. His arms instructor, a scarred veteran named Victorinus, was overheard saying, "The emperor handles a gladius like a surgeon handles a hammer." But Marcus persisted, rising at dawn for training, despite muscles that screamed in protest, hands that bled from unaccustomed weapon practice. Fina found him one night in his study, not reading philosophy, but studying tactical diagrams, moving carved pieces across maps like a child learning chess. "You're going to get yourself killed," she said bluntly. "Probably," he replied without looking up. "But if I die as a coward in Rome, the empire dies with me. If I die fighting on the Danube, at least the next emperor inherits courage instead of shame." She watched him for a long moment, then began helping him memorize Germanic tribal standards. "If you're going to die stupidly," she said, "at least die knowing which barbarian is killing you." The march north revealed the plague's second devastation. Marcus had to recruit gladiators, slaves, and even brigands to fill depleted legions. He armed them with weapons from Rome's ancient victory monuments, melting down statues for bronze, selling imperial artwork for supplies. Towns along the route were ghostly, doors marked with plague signs, streets empty except for feral dogs. At Carnuntum on the Danube, Marcus saw the frontier's reality. Fortresses held by skeleton garrisons, walls crumbling from neglect, commanders who hadn't received pay in months. His first military council was a disaster. Professional generals could barely hide their contempt as Marcus suggested tactics from textbooks. Pompeianus, his most experienced commander, interrupted. Caesar with respect. Xenophon fought Greeks who announced their battles with heralds. Germans attack at night naked, screaming, covered in bare fat. Your books are useless here. Marcus absorbed the humiliation, then asked, "Then teach me what is useful." The admission of ignorance, rather than weakening his authority, somehow strengthened it. Soldiers who had expected an aloof intellectual found an emperor willing to learn. The first battle came sooner than expected. Germanic scouts found Marcus's camp near the frozen Danube. He woke to horns and screaming, grabbed a sword he barely knew how to use, and stepped out of his tent to see 8,000 Quati warriors charging across the ice. His baptism in blood was about to begin, and the philosopher who had spent his life contemplating the nature of death would discover what it felt like to cause it. The blood wouldn't come off his hands. Marcus Aurelius sat in his command tent at Canutum, scrubbing his fingers in a bronze basin while outside the screams of wounded Germans being executed mixed with the moans of dying Romans. 3 hours earlier, he had killed his first man, a Quadi warrior no older than his own son, Commodus, whose eyes had widened in surprise when the emperor's sword found his throat. Now, in the flickering lamplight, Marcus opened a fresh wax tablet and wrote, "Today, I learned that we are all just bags of blood and breath waiting to spill. This was not meant for history." The words Marcus began scratching into wax that winter night in 171 were never intended for other eyes. He titled them simply "To Heir Out On" to himself. private notes in Greek, the language of philosophy, not Latin, the language of empire. They were the desperate attempt of a man trying not to lose his soul while wading through literal rivers of blood. Each entry was a lifeline thrown to his drowning philosophical ideals, a reminder that somewhere beneath the armour and the killing, Marcus, the student of wisdom, still existed. The conditions under which he wrote would have defeated most writers. His tent, pitched on frozen ground, was so cold that ink congealed and wax tablets cracked. He wrote by the light of a single oil lamp that filled the space with smoke that made his eyes stream. Outside, 20,000 soldiers created a constant cacophony, hammering armour, sharpening swords, the occasional scream when surgeons sawed through gangrenous limbs without anaesthesia. He wrote anyway, usually in the black hours before dawn, when exhaustion should have claimed him, stealing time from sleep to save his sanity. The first entries reveal a man in psychological freeall. The rotting bodies of Quadian Romans look identical. So much for racial superiority. Another, that boy I killed yesterday. Did he have a father who taught him courage? A mother who kissed his forehead? I am praised for ending his story. This is what they call victory. The philosophy he had studied for 30 years seemed suddenly academic, almost insulting in its cleanliness. Epictetus had never addressed how to maintain stoic calm while pulling your sword from a teenager's intestines. His secretary, a Greek slave named Lucius, later testified about finding Marcus writing one dawn, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Master, you should rest," Lucius suggested. Marcus didn't look up. "If I stop writing, I'll forget who I am. I'll become just another warlord, another Nero or Caligula drunk on blood. These words are my anchor. What he was writing that morning survives. Remember that very soon you will be dead, and none of these things will matter except how you chose to act, how you chose to think." The Meditations were therapeutic in the most literal sense, medicine for a diseased soul. Marcus used them to process the horrors surrounding him. After watching auxiliaries massacre Germanic prisoners, he wrote how much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbour says or does. After ordering decimation, the execution of every 10th man in a mutinous cohort, he wrote, "Every action must be performed as if it were your last." The abstractions of classroom stoicism became concrete survival tools. Word spread through the camp that the emperor wrote philosophy at night. Some generals mocked it as weakness, but common soldiers began to regard it with superstitious awe. Here was Caesar who could order any pleasure or distraction, choosing instead to examine his conscience. A centurion named Cassius later said, "We'd seen emperors who wrote poetry, who painted, who sang, but an emperor who questioned whether he deserved to be emperor. That was new. It made us fight harder, knowing he suffered the same doubts we did." What Marcus didn't know was that these private notebooks, never meant for publication, would outlive his empire by 2,000 years. The desperate scribblings of a philosopher king trying not to go insane would become humanity's manual for dignity under pressure. But on those frozen nights on the Danube, they were simply one man's desperate attempt to remain human while doing inhuman things. And those inhuman necessities were about to multiply as Marcus discovered that fighting barbarians was simple compared to governing the civilized. The Christian woman stood before Marcus Aurelius in chains, her back already bloody from scourging, and spoke words that would haunt him forever. "You write about justice in your tent at night, Caesar. I am living it in your arena tomorrow." Her name was Blandina, a slave from Danube, and she would be thrown to beast the next morning for refusing to sacrifice to Roman gods. Marcus had the power to free her with a single word. He remained silent. This was the excruciating paradox of Marcus's reign. The philosopher who believed in universal human dignity presided over some of the most horrific Christian persecutions in Roman history. Every morning, whether in Rome or his military camps, Marcus held court for 2 hours, personally judging cases that provincial governors sent to him. Murder, treason, property disputes, and increasingly the problem of Christians who refused to participate in state religious ceremonies. The law was clear: refuse to sacrifice to Roman gods, especially the emperor's genius, and face death. The philosopher who questioned everything could not question Roman law. The cognitive dissonance nearly broke him. In his private meditations he wrote, "We were born to work together like feet, hands, and eyes. To obstruct each other is unnatural." Yet that same morning he had signed death warrants for 17 Christians in Asia Minor, whose only crime was gathering to sing hymns. When his secretary pointed out the contradiction, Marcus responded with unusual sharpness. A private man can afford philosophy. An emperor who allows subjects to reject state religion invites chaos. Would you have me be Nero, who let Rome burn while he pursued his artistic vision? The cases that reached him were deliberately chosen to test his resolve. A Roman citizen named Tommy discovered teaching Christianity to a senator's wife, causing her to demand divorce from her pagan husband. The husband wanted blood. The Christians wanted martyrdom. Marcus tried compromise, exile him to the frontier, let him preach to Germans, but Tommy refused. "Send me to your beasts, Caesar. My God awaits." Marcus signed the death order, then wrote that night, "Men seek retreats in the country, by the shore, in the mountains. You too have made a habit of this, but this is entirely unnecessary when you can retreat into yourself at any moment." The most grotesque case involved the martyrs of Lyons in 177. Local authorities facing mob violence against Christians blamed for causing the plague through their atheism, their refusal to acknowledge Roman gods, had arrested dozens. The detailed report Marcus received described torture that made even hardened soldiers vomit. Christians roasted on iron chairs, torn by wild animals trained to wound but not kill. Forced to watch their children executed first, the governor asked for guidance. Should he show mercy to those who recanted? Marcus's response, preserved in provincial archives, was technically merciful, but practically homicidal. Roman citizens who recant should be beheaded quickly. Non-citizens who recant should be released. Those who persist should face the beasts. His philosophical friends were appalled. Rusticus, his old Stoic teacher, confronted him. "You know, these Christians harm no one. Their crime is peculiar theology, not treason." Marcus's reply revealed his impossible position. Every group that refuses state religion encourages others. Today, Christians; tomorrow, Jews refuse military service. Next week, Germans demand their gods be honoured in Roman temples. The empire is held together by shared ritual, not shared belief. Break that and 50 million people become 50 million individuals with nothing in common but geography. Yet in his private writings the guilt bled through. How much more damage is done by anger and grief than by the circumstances that provoke them? He was writing about himself, the anger at being forced to choose between philosophical ideals and imperial stability, the grief of signing death sentences for people whose only crime was conviction. The man who wrote beautifully about universal brotherhood spent his days dividing humanity into those who deserved mercy and those who deserved death. The Christian historianius would later claim Marcus was the cruelest persecutor, worse than Nero or Domitian. The pagan historian Cassius Dio praised him for maintaining order, despite provincial fanaticism. Both were correct. The philosopher emperor had discovered the most bitter truth of power. Sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. But even as Marcus wrestled with the burden of justice, a more personal tragedy was unfolding in his own household, one that would test his Stoic principles more than any Christian martyr ever could. Marcus Aurelius found the letter hidden in a dispatch case meant for military reports, written in his wife's unmistakable hand. "My dearest Ovidius, the nights without you are agony. Marcus suspects nothing. Lost in his scrolls, while the empire you should rule crumbles around his philosophy. The emperor read it 3 times, set it down carefully, then burned it in his lamp flame without calling for his guards. Whether the letter was genuine or forged would torture historians for 2,000 years. It tortured Marcus for the rest of his life." Phina the Younger had given Marcus 13 children over 30 years of marriage, following him from plague-ravaged Rome to freezing military camps on the Danube. She was beautiful, intelligent, and absolutely unimpressed by her husband's philosophical pretensions. Where Marcus agonized over decisions, she acted. Where he quoted dead Greeks, she counted living soldiers. The troops adored her, calling her mother of the camps after she personally distributed her own jewellery to pay their bonuses when the treasury ran empty. Yet rumours followed her like shadows, affairs with gladiators, conspiracies with generals, a sexual appetite that supposedly exhausted lovers half her age. The specific accusations about Ovidius Cassius were particularly damaging. Cassius was Marcus's most successful general, a ruthless disciplinarian governing Syria with an iron hand. Witnesses claimed Phina visited his tent at night during eastern campaigns. Others swore they intercepted messages suggesting she wanted Cassius to declare himself emperor if Marcus died of the plague. The Senate whispered that she found her husband's gentle philosophy weak, that she wanted a real warrior as emperor, that she was preparing to rule through cases after Marcus's conveniently timed death. Marcus's response revealed a man caught between public duty and private agony. In public, he defended Faustina with ferocious loyalty. When a senator suggested investigating the rumours, Marcus replied, "Question my wife's honour again, and I'll question whether your tongue is necessary for your survival." He elevated her to Augusta, had her image stamped on coins labelled Felicitas, happiness, and insisted she accompany him everywhere, making her absence from any supposed lover physically impossible. His public face showed a devoted husband. His private writings revealed torment in his meditations. Never naming her directly, he wrote, "How much trouble you avoid by not looking at what others do in their bedchambers." Another entry, more pointed, "Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, but do so with your whole heart, even when that heart is breaking." The philosopher who preached emotional detachment couldn't achieve it in his own marriage. He loved a woman he couldn't trust, and that uncertainty ate at him like the plague consuming his empire. Phina herself left no writings, no defence, but her action spoke volumes. When Marcus fell seriously ill in a 175, she didn't flee to Rome or to any supposed lover. She stayed by his bed, nursing him personally, refusing to let physicians bleed him when she thought it would weaken him further. A servant later testified that she spent 3 days without sleep, forcing broth between Marcus's lips, whispering, "Don't you dare die and leave me to manage your impossible son alone." Whether guilty or innocent of adultery, she fought for his life with desperate determination. The truth emerged through tragedy when Ovidius Cassius did eventually rebel, declaring Marcus dead and himself emperor. Faustina was with Marcus hundreds of miles away, visibly pregnant with their last child. If she had orchestrated the rebellion, her timing was catastrophically incompetent. Marcus's reaction was telling. He immediately wrote to Cassius offering forgiveness if he surrendered, more concerned with civil war than personal betrayal. "If my wife conspired with you," he wrote, "then I am such a poor husband that death would be a mercy." But Phina would never face trial or vindication. As they travelled through Cappadocia that winter, She died suddenly in a remote mountain village called Halala. Some claimed poison, others a stroke. Marcus held her body and wept publicly for the second time in his reign. He renamed the village Phinopolos, established a charity for orphan girls in her name, and had her deified despite Senate protests. In his final mention of her in the Meditations, he wrote simply, "She was what she was. I chose to love what I chose to see." The emperor who sought wisdom in everything never found answers about his own wife, but her death left him to face his next crisis alone. A trusted general's rebellion that would test whether his philosophy of mercy could survive the reality of civil war. Avidius Cassius received the news while inspecting fortifications in Antioch. Marcus Aurelius was dead, killed by plague on the Danube frontier. Without waiting for confirmation, without even pausing to remove his dusty armour, Cassius climbed the steps of Jupiter's temple and declared himself Emperor of Rome. The legions of Syria who had followed him through brutal Parthian campaigns roared their approval. Within 3 days, Egypt, Syria, and most of Asia Minor had sworn allegiance to him. The man Marcus had trusted to govern the east while he fought in the north had just split the empire in half. The truth was that Marcus was very much alive, recovering from severe illness in Sirmium. When messengers brought word of Cassius's rebellion, the emperor's first response wasn't rage, but exhaustion. "Not Avidius," he said quietly, still weak from fever. He was the only general I trusted to act without supervision. The betrayal cut deeper than any German blade. Cassius wasn't just a commander. He was a philosophical sparring partner, one of the few men who could challenge Marcus's ideas without Thing. Their correspondence preserved in imperial archives showed genuine intellectual friendship. Now that friend had committed the one unforgivable crime in Roman politics, Cassius was everything Marcus wasn't. Tall, scarred, physically magnificent even at 50. The son of a Syrian rhetoric who had clawed his way up through sheer brutality. He governed through fear where Marcus sought respect. His nickname among the legions was Iron Hand, after he crucified an entire cohort for cowardice, leaving their bodies to rot along the road to Ctesiphon. He would drill troops until they collapsed, execute centurions for minor infractions, then share his own rations with common soldiers during sieges. They hated him. They would die for him. The strategic situation was catastrophic. Marcus had most of the Western legions, but was exhausted from years of Germanic wars. Cassius controlled the wealthy eastern provinces and their fresh troops. More critically, he controlled Egypt, Rome's grain supply. He could starve the capital into submission without fighting a single battle. Marcus's advisors urged immediate action. March east. Crush the rebellion before it solidified. The Senate, panicking, began compiling list of Cassius's suspected sympathizers for preemptive execution. Marcus's response stunned everyone. He forbade the Senate from declaring Cassius a public enemy. He ordered that any correspondence from potential conspirators be burned unread. When his own son Commodus demanded they march immediately to Syria, Marcus replied, "If Cassius is meant to be emperor, we cannot kill him. If he is not, he will destroy himself without our help." This wasn't just philosophy, it was calculated genius. Marcus understood that civil wars created more emperors than they destroyed. By refusing to panic, he denied Cassius the crisis atmosphere that legitimized usurpation. Instead, Marcus wrote Cassius a letter that survived in Dionysius's history. "Old friend, you have made yourself emperor based on false news. I am alive, though I sometimes wish otherwise, given the burdens we both know. Surrender now, and I swear by the gods that neither you nor your family will be harmed. Continue, and you force me to become the tyrant philosophy taught us both to despise. You are my best general. Do not make me prove I've learned your lessons about ruthlessness." Cassius never received the letter. As his rebellion entered its 3rd month, cracks appeared in his support. Egyptian legions, learning Marcus lived, began deserting. Syrian merchants, calculating that Marcus's western armies would eventually triumph, stopped supplying Cassius's forces. The decisive moment came when a centurion named Antonius, hoping for reward, approached Cassius during a military review. As Cassius leaned down from his horse to hear a supposed urgent message, Antonius drove a dagger through his throat. A cavalry officer, following suit, decapitated the would-be emperor before his bodyguards could react. The head arrived at Marcus's camp, preserved in salt. The eye still open in surprise, Marcus refused to look at it, ordering immediate burial with full honours. He wept. Witnesses differ, whether from grief or relief. Then he did something unprecedented. He travelled to the rebellious provinces not to punish but to forgive. He burned all documents relating to the conspiracy, pardoned every supporter of cases and confirmed most in their positions. "The empire has seen enough blood," he told the Syrian legions. "Your crime was loyalty to your commander. That is no crime at all. The mercy was strategic brilliance disguised as philosophy." By forgiving rather than purging, Marcus prevented the cycle of vengeance that typically followed civil wars. But privately the betrayal had broken something in him. His meditations grew darker. When men hate you, remember that they will all be dead soon, and you as well. Marcus had passed his greatest test of forgiveness, but the universe was preparing an even crueler examination, one that would come from his own blood. The Syrian aristocrats who had supported Avidius Cassius waited in the great hall of Antioch's basilica, some already wearing funeral to expecting to hear their death sentences from the emperor they had betrayed. Instead, Marcus Aurelius entered alone without guards and spoke words that defied 500 years of Roman precedent. "Go home to your families. Your error was trusting false news. Mine was governing so poorly that rebellion seemed reasonable." This scene, recorded by multiple witnesses, captures the radical nature of Marcus's response to the rebellion, where Sulla had proscribed thousands after a civil war, where Augustus had murdered hundreds after Actium, where even the divine Tran had executed conspirators' children to prevent future vengeance. Marcus chose a path that seemed like madness to Roman sensibilities. He didn't just spare the rebels, he actively protected them from consequences. The proconsul of Asia, eager to prove loyalty, had arrested Cassius's son and prepared a spectacular execution. Marcus's response was immediate and harsh. Release him immediately or face charges yourself for unauthorized violence against a Roman citizen. When the son was brought before him, Marcus appointed him to a minor administrative post in Alexandria. "Your father was my friend before he was my enemy," he told the young man. "I choose to remember the friend." The appointment wasn't just mercy. It was a calculated demonstration that the civil war was over, that there would be no blood debts to settle for generations. In Cappadocia, local authorities had compiled lists of merchants who had supplied Caesar's forces. They expected rewards for their diligence. Instead, Marcus ordered the list burned in the public square without reading them. "If knowing who supported rebellion would make me a better emperor," he announced to the assembled crowd, "then I have already failed." He went further, confirming local magistrates in their positions, even when evidence suggested they had hedged their bets during the rebellion. A government of forgiven traitors, he calculated, would be more stable than one of resentful replacements. The most extraordinary moment came in Alexandria, where Cassius had been genuinely popular. The city leaders, terrified of collective punishment, had prepared massive tributes: gold, grain, precious stones. Marcus refused everything except the standard annual tax. When he entered the city, instead of triumph displays, He visited the tomb of Alexander the Great and the Great Library. He attended philosophical lectures, participated in public debates about Platonic ideals, and never once mentioned the rebellion. The message was clear. Alexandria was not a conquered city, but a wayward child welcomed home. His own advisers were horrified. Pompeianus, his son-in-law and most trusted general, confronted him privately. Caesar, mercy is admirable, but this invites future rebellion. If betrayal has no consequences, why would anyone stay loyal? Marcus's response revealed the cold calculation behind his clemency. Fear keeps men obedient only while you're watching. I need the East to govern itself while I fight Germans for the next decade. Dead men's families plot revenge, forgiven men owe debts. The Senate, bloodthirsty and paranoid, had already begun proceedings against suspected sympathizers in Rome. Marcus's letter to them survives, a masterpiece of controlled fury. I have pardoned those who raised armies against me. Will you execute those who merely wrote letters? I forbid any prosecution related to this rebellion. Any senator who disobeys will explain to me personally why he believes himself wiser than his emperor. The trial stopped immediately, yet this mercy came at personal cost. In his meditations, Marcus revealed the effort required to forgive. Today I wanted to strangle the Egyptian prefect who certainly knew of the plot. Instead, I confirmed his position and complimented his tax collection. The hardest battles are against your own nature. Another entry. They mistake my mercy for weakness. The weak man kills from fear. It takes strength to let enemies live. The Eastern tour lasted 6 months. Marcus visited every major city that had supported Cassius, distributing his presence like medicine, healing through visibility rather than violence. By the time he returned to the Danube to resume the Germanic wars, the eastern provinces were more loyal than before the rebellion. He had transformed treason into a demonstration of imperial clemency. But while Marcus was perfecting the art of forgiveness with strangers, he remained blind to the growing darkness in someone much closer. His own son, whose nature would mock every principle the philosopher emperor held sacred. Marcus Aurelius watched his 15-year-old son Commodus force a palace slave to eat rotting meat, while court sycophants laughed, and in that moment understood that the gods had played the cruelest possible joke on a philosopher who preached virtue. They'd given him a son who embodied everything he despised. The emperor closed his eyes, composed himself, then did what he had done every day since recognizing his heir's nature. He pretended not to see. Commodus was physically magnificent in ways his father never was. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of beauty that made sculptors beg to capture him in marble. Where Marcus had struggled to learn swordplay in his 40s, Commodus, at 12, could defeat grown gladiators in exhibition matches. He could throw a javelin with deadly accuracy, ride horses like a Parthian, and possessed a natural charisma that made soldiers cheer when he merely walked past. He was also, by every account that survived, a sadistic narcissist who viewed other humans as toys for his amusement. The signs had started early. At age 8, Commodus had ordered a bath slave flay because the water was too cold. Marcus had intervened, privately paying the slave's family and sending the man to a distant estate. At 10, Commodus had blinded a playmate with a stylus during a grammar lesson, claiming the boy had looked at him disrespectfully. At 13, he had seduced his sister Lucilla's chambermaid, then had the girl sold to a brothel when she became pregnant, joking that she could earn her keep on her back since she had learned the position so well. Yet, in 177, Marcus made the fateful decision that would define his legacy's darkest chapter. He elevated Commodus to co-emperor, making him the youngest consul in Roman history. The Senate was appalled but silent. everyone could see what Commodus was except apparently his father. Or perhaps Marcus saw everything and chose the stability of dynastic succession over the chaos of choosing a worthier heir. His private writings suggest agonizing doubt. Nature has made him my son. Duty makes him Rome's future. Philosophy must make him human. The elevation ceremony was revealing. While Marcus wore a simple purple toga, Commodus had commissioned armour of gold-plated silver that reportedly cost more than a year's grain supply for a legion. When time came to take the oath, Commodus added unauthorized words. "I accept this burden until the gods prepare me for greater glory." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. That night he wrote in his journal, "A good man can make a bad son, but can a bad son become a good emperor? I must believe transformation is possible, or everything I've taught means nothing." Marcus tried everything. He assigned Commodus the best tutors, surrounding him with philosophers who spoke of duty and virtue until the boy would literally flee their presence. He brought him to the Danube frontier, hoping that seeing real suffering would develop empathy. Instead, Commodus spent his time organizing elaborate hunts, once killing 100 bears in a single day and demanding the army celebrate his prowess. When German envoys came to negotiate, Commodus insulted their appearance so grotesquely that they nearly declared war on the spot. Marcus had to personally apologize, claiming his son was ill. The breaking point came when Commodus, bored during a military council discussing grain supplies for winter quarters, announced he had a solution for the Germanic problem. Kill them all, women, children, elderly. Leave no one alive. Empty land can't rebel. The tent fell silent. Hardened generals who had spent decades fighting barbarians looked shocked. Marcus responded quietly, "Thank you for your input, Caesar. We'll continue with conventional strategy." That night, Pompeianus found Marcus weeping in his tent. "I've created a monster," the emperor said, "and I've given him the power to destroy everything I've built." But the most tragic aspect was that Commodus genuinely loved his father in his own twisted way. He would spend hours listening to Marcus's philosophical lectures, not from interest, but from a desperate need for approval. He memorized Stoic texts to impress him, reciting them while wearing jewels with the province's annual tribute. He couldn't understand why Marcus looked sad when he perfectly quoted Epictetus while having a slave whipped for dropping a wine cup. The father and son travelled together to the Danube for what would be Marcus's final campaign, each pretending the other was something he wasn't. Marcus pretending Commodus could change, Commodus pretending he wanted to. The auctioneer held up Marcus Aurelius's ceremonial golden dinner service, the one Hadrian had commissioned 60 years earlier, with jewels representing every province of the empire, and announced the starting bid. 30,000 sisters for the divine emperor's personal property. The crowd in Trajan's forum gasped, not at the price, but at the sight of their emperor selling his own possessions like a bankrupt merchant liquidating his warehouse. The empire was bleeding money faster than a severed artery loses blood. 15 years of continuous warfare had drained the treasury to dust. The Germanic campaigns alone cost 800,000 sesterces per day. The price of maintaining 28 legions on active campaign, building endless fortifications, bribing tribal allies, and replacing equipment lost in countless skirmishes. The plague had eliminated a third of the tax base. Egyptian grain revenues had collapsed. Syrian trade routes were severed. The silver mines of Dycia, once Rome's treasure house, were producing at a fraction of capacity because too many miners had died of disease. Marcus's financial advisors presented the traditional solution to base the currency: confiscate senatorial estates, squeeze the provinces with emergency taxes. Previous emperors had done all three. usually simultaneously. Nero had clipped silver coins until they were mostly copper. Domitian had executed wealthy senators just to seize their fortunes. But Marcus looked at the ledgers and made an extraordinary decision. We'll sell everything. I don't need to govern. The empire shouldn't suffer for its emperor's wars. The auction lasted 2 months. In the autumn of 169, Marcus emptied the imperial palaces of anything valuable that wasn't essential for state ceremony. Silk robes from China that had taken 3 years to reach Rome, crystalline vessels from Alexandria that rang like bells when struck, furniture carved from African ivory and Indian ebony. His wife Fina's jewellery collection went on the block, pearls the size of pigeon eggs, emeralds that had belonged to Cleopatra, a diamond necklace worth more than a small city's annual budget. Even Marcus's personal library, including manuscripts in Aristotle's own hand, was offered for sale. The spectacle was unprecedented. Rome's elite gathered daily in the Forum not just to buy, but to witness their philosopher emperor dismantling the visual symbols of imperial excess. Herod's Atticus, Marcus's old rhetoric teacher and one of the empire's richest men, bought Marcus's collection of Greek statuary for 1 million sisters, then tried to donate it back. Marcus refused. If you wish to help, keep the statues and pay the soldiers. Art doesn't stop barbarian swords. More painful were the personal items. Marcus sold the purple cloaks his children had worn for state ceremonies, knowing he was literally selling his family's memories. A Syrian merchant bought Commodus' childhood toy soldiers, golden figurines commissioned by Hadrian, while Commodus himself stood watching, his face unreadable. Marcus's personal armour worn during his first Germanic campaign went to an Egyptian grain dealer who wanted it for his private shrine. "I'm selling my past to buy Rome's future," Marcus told Fonto, who recorded the emperor's exhaustion. The common people's reaction was complex. Some mocked. Our philosopher emperor discovers that wisdom doesn't pay for wars, but most were moved. Here was Caesar, who could have simply seized their property, instead selling his own. Veterans began donating their discharge bonuses back to the treasury. Wealthy freed men competed to pay inflated prices for imperial goods, treating it as patriotic duty. The auction raised 40 million sisters, enough to fund 2 full campaigning seasons. But Marcus went further. He reduced the imperial household by 3/4, dismissing thousands of servants, closing pleasure gardens, eliminating ceremonial positions that had existed since Augustus. He ate barley bread like a common soldier, wore the same toga until it fell apart, walked instead of using litters. When senators complained this damaged imperial dignity, Marcus replied, "Ding is not what you own, but how you behave when you own nothing." The economic crisis wasn't solved. It wouldn't be until long after Marcus's death, but his response transformed it from potential catastrophe into moral victory. He had shown that even absolute power could practice sacrifice. Yet even as he sold his treasures to fund the armies, those armies were about to face their greatest test on the frozen banks of the Danube. The Germanic warrior's severed head landed at Marcus Aurelius's feet during morning council. Thrown by Balamar, king of the Mark of Manny, who stood just beyond arrow range, shouting in broken Latin, "Philosopher, how many Roman heads before you learn to go home?" It was the 5th year of the Maremomanic Wars, and Marcus, now 57, looked like a man being slowly crushed between millstones, each day grinding away more of his body while somehow sharpening his resolve. The frontier had become Marcus's entire world. For 6 consecutive winters, he had lived in military camps along the Danube, wooden fortifications that turned to freezing mud in autumn and baking dust in summer. His headquarters at Canutum was a grim collection of timber buildings surrounded by ditches filled with sharpened stakes and Germanic corpses that nobody had time to bury properly. The emperor who had once slept in marble palaces now woke to ice forming on his beard. His joints so stiff from cold and damp that slaves had to massage his hands before he could hold a stylus. The war had devolved into something that would have horrified Caesar or Trajan. Not grand battles, but endless grinding attrition. The Marimomani and their allies had learned they couldn't defeat Roman legions in open combat, so they turned to tactics that drove Marcus's generals to desperation. Night raids where warriors covered in mud would slip through sentries and set fire to supply wagons. Poisoned wells that killed entire cohorts. False surrenders followed by ambushes that left Roman patrols crucified along forest paths. Their eyes pecked out by crows. Marcus himself had transformed from philosopher to something harder. The man who once agonized over signing death warrants now ordered entire villages burned without hesitation when they harbored raiders. He watched his own executions, forcing himself not to look away when Germanic prisoners were strangled or beheaded. "If I order death," he told his secretary, "I must witness it. Otherwise I become like those emperors who killed from comfort." His hair, still dark when the wars began, was now completely white. Deep lines carved his face like erosion marks on cliffstone. The miracle came in 174, though calling it a miracle requires either faith or desperation. The 12th Legion, Marcus's thunderbolt, was surrounded in a valley by quite warriors. 3 days without water in summer heat, soldiers were drinking their own urine, some cutting horses' veins for blood. Marcus stood with them, refusing the last reserve save for commanders. Then the sky, clear moments before, erupted. Rain fell so violently that Quadi warriors claimed they saw the face of a god in the clouds. Romans drank from their shields while lightning struck the enemy positions with impossible accuracy. The legion escaped, slaughtering their confused opponents. Christians later claimed their prayers saved the legion. Egyptian priests credited Hermes Thoth Marcus himself when asked what happened, said only when men are desperate enough sometimes the universe responds, or perhaps clouds are simply clouds, and we survive through meteorological coincidence. But that night alone in his tent he wrote in his Meditations today, water fell from the sky, and men called it divine intervention. Yesterday the same sky gave us nothing while good soldiers died of thirst. The gods, if they exist, have peculiar timing. Those meditations had become his only escape from the war's horror. Each night, no matter how exhausted, he would light his lamp and write. The entries from these years are shorter, more bitter, but somehow more profound. You can hold your breath until you turn blue, but you'll still need to breathe. You can refuse to change, but you'll still die. Everything is change. Even this war will end. Another. That German boy I killed today. Someone taught him courage. I sent him to his gods. Perhaps they'll treat him better than mine treat me. By 178, Marcus could barely mount a horse without assistance. His stomach, always weak, could only tolerate water and bread. Yet still he remained on the frontier, knowing that the moment he left, everything would collapse. He was holding the northern border through pure will, a dying philosopher emperor refusing to let go. But his body was failing faster than he could admit, and the final campaign was about to begin. The letter was stained with wine and what might have been tears. "Dear Fonto," I write at 3 o'clock in the morning because sleep is impossible. My shoulder throbs where a German arrow found the gap in my armour. Commodus spent today torturing prisoners for sport. 6 of my children are dead, and tomorrow I must pretend that I am Caesar, that I know what I'm doing, that philosophy has answers for any of this. When Marcus Cornelius died in 166, he left behind hundreds of letters exchanged with Marcus Aurelius over 30 years. The only surviving window into the emperor's unguarded thoughts. These weren't philosophical meditations crafted for posterity, but raw, sometimes petty, often desperate communications between a student and the teacher he loved more than his own father. They reveal a Marcus that his public writings carefully concealed, exhausted, irritated, grief-stricken, and profoundly lonely even while surrounded by thousands. The physical complaints are relentless. Marcus suffered from chronic chest pain that made breathing difficult, stomach ulcers that limited him to bland porridge, insomnia that left him hallucinating from exhaustion. "My body," he wrote to Fonto in 162, "is a collection of failing parts held together by will and wine vinegar compresses. Yesterday during Senate proceedings, I nearly fainted. I covered it by pretending to deep contemplation. 40 senators probably think I was having a philosophical epiphany. I was trying not to vomit. His grief over his children pervades the correspondence. Of 13 births, only 5 survived to adulthood. Each death broke him differently. When his twin sons died at age 4, he wrote, 'They spoke their first words on the same day. Papa, they died 3 days apart. I burned them in the same pea because I couldn't bear 2 ceremonies. Fina hasn't spoken in a week.' I quote Stoicism at her. She looks at me with such hatred. After his daughter, Dicia, died. She was the clever one, Fronto. She could have been a philosopher. Instead, she's ashen an urn that cost more than most Romans earn in a lifetime. The loneliness is perhaps most striking. I am surrounded constantly," he wrote from the Danube, "by generals who think me weak, soldiers who need me to appear strong, and Commodus, who needs me to be something I'm not. Proud of him. I speak to thousands daily. I have real conversations with no one except you through these letters. And now you're dying in Rome while I freeze in Germania, pretending that holding this frontier matters. His frustrations with court life border on rage. Today I spent 4 hours listening to 2 senators argue about water rights to a stream that dried up a decade ago. Both knew it was dry. Neither would admit it, because admitting it would mean admitting they've been stealing taxes for imaginary agriculture. I wanted to have them both strangled. Instead, I ruled that they should share the non-existent water. They thanked me for my wisdom. This is what ruling the world actually means, managing the lies of mediocrities. About Commodus, his anguish is absolute. I have failed, not as emperor, but as father. He has my blood, but nothing else of me. Yesterday he asked why we don't simply kill all the Senate and rule without their tedious complaints. He wasn't joking. He genuinely doesn't understand why other humans matter. How did I create this? Fina blames my absence. I blame my presence. He learned to perform virtue without feeling it, watching me. The most revealing letter came shortly before Fonto's death. Sometimes I dream I'm still in your classroom passing Greek verbs, my greatest worry being whether I've prepared adequately. Then I wake to find I'm Caesar, that millions depend on my decisions, that my son is a monster, my wife is probably unfaithful, and my body is disintegrating. Philosophy says to accept what fate brings. I accept it. But between you and me, old teacher, fate is a sadistic bastard. These letters strip away the marble statue of Stoic perfection, revealing a man drowning in responsibilities he never wanted, sustained only by duty and the desperate hope that his suffering meant something. Yet, even while pouring out his heart to Fronto, Marcus was developing a revolutionary approach to the empire's enemies that would transform warfare into something approaching wisdom. The Quadi chieftain knelt in the mud before Marcus Aurelius, expecting the traditional Roman terms: execution for leaders, slavery for warriors, rape and servitude for women and children. Instead, the emperor spoke words that made his own generals exchange alarmed glances. Rise, you will keep your weapons. Your families will farm Roman land as free people. Your sons will serve in our auxiliaries for citizenship. You're no longer enemies, you are future Romans. This radical policy implemented in 127 shattered 4 centuries of Roman conquest tradition. Since the Republic's earliest days, defeated barbarians faced 2 fates: immediate slaughter or chains. Julius Caesar had sold entire Gic tribes in slave markets. Trajan had depopulated Dia so thoroughly that Latin is still spoken there today. But Marcus, the philosopher emperor who had spent 7 years fighting these same tribes, chose integration over annihilation. He called it receptio, the receiving, transforming Rome's deadliest enemies into its newest defenders. The mechanics were revolutionary in their complexity. Defeated tribes weren't simply dumped on Roman land to cause new problems. Marcus created detailed settlement contracts written in both Latin and runic symbols, specifying exactly where each clan could settle, how many cattle they could keep, what percentage of young men would serve in auxiliary units. The Nerist received lands in Pannonia, abandoned by plague. The Catini were settled along the Danube as border guards against their former allies. 11,000 Sarmatian cavalry were sent to Britain, as far from their homeland as possible, where they became the foundation of what would later inspire Arthurian legend. His own military council was horrified. Pompeianus, his most loyal general, confronted him after watching 5,000 Marcomanni warriors cross into Roman territory with their weapons. Caesar, we've spent a decade bleeding to keep these savages out. Now you're inviting them in, armed. Marcus's response revealed years of strategic thinking. Every German I settle on Roman land is one less warrior raiding across the frontier. Every auxiliary I recruit is a soldier I don't have to conscript from plague-emptied Roman towns. Every barbarian child who grows up inside the empire thinks in Latin. Praise to Roman gods sees Rome as home rather than enemy. The Senate's reaction was volcanic. Senator Claudius Maximus delivered a 3-hour speech warning that Marcus was planting the seeds of Rome's destruction. These barbarians will breed like rats. In 2 generations they'll outnumber true Romans. We're committing ethnic suicide. Marcus listened patiently, then responded with statistics. The plague has killed 8 million citizens. The Germanic tribes of perhaps 2 million people total. Would you rather have empty farms and undefended borders or productive settlers who owe their survival to Roman mercy? The practical results were immediately visible. The Aziz settled as Federati provided 8,000 cavalry that proved decisive in subsequent campaigns. Their knowledge of Germanic tactics and terrain was invaluable. They could track enemy movements through forests where Roman scouts got lost, negotiate with hostile tribes in their own languages, fight with the same brutal effectiveness as their former allies. When a massive Vandal invasion threatened in 178, it was Yazygan auxiliary cavalry who destroyed them before they reached the Danube. But Marcus went beyond military pragmatism. He insisted settled tribes maintain their own laws for internal disputes, their own religious practices, even their own languages alongside mandatory Latin education. Roman conservatives saw this as dangerous pluralism. Marcus saw it as psychological wisdom. A man forced to abandon everything becomes nothing but hate. A man allowed to keep his dignity while gaining new opportunities becomes grateful. Grateful men don't rebel. The most controversial aspect was intermarriage. Marcus not only permitted but encouraged unions between settled barbarians and Roman colonists, offering tax incentives for mixed families. When senators protested this dilution of Roman blood, Marcus asked, "What is Roman blood? We're already a mixture of Latins, Etruscans, Greeks, Gauls, Iberians. Adding Germanic strength to that alloy makes us stronger, not weaker." His own meditations from this period show deeper thinking. Nature has no chosen people. We're all mixtures becoming new mixtures. This revolutionary policy would outlive Marcus by centuries, fundamentally transforming what it meant to be Roman. But as he implemented these radical changes, his own body was finally surrendering to decades of war, plague, and responsibility. Marcus Aurelius collapsed during the morning briefing, blood spattering across the strategic maps of Germania as he coughed until his ribs cracked audibly. And when his generals tried to carry him to his bed, he grabbed the tent pole and pulled himself upright. "I'll die standing or not at all. We march for the Danube tomorrow." It was late summer 178, and everyone except Marcus admitted what was obvious. The emperor was dying. His weight had dropped so drastically that his armour hung loose even after 3 adjustments. His skin had taken on the yellowish tint that physicians recognise but wouldn't name aloud. He could no longer digest solid food, surviving on honeyed water and wine mixed with poppy juice, for the pain that made him grind his teeth until they cracked. Yet he insisted on returning to the frontier for one final campaign, driven by terrible knowledge. If he didn't secure the Danube before his death, Commodus would abandon it within days of his funeral. The journey from Rome to Canunum should have taken 3 weeks. It took Marcus 2 months. He had to stop every few hours, too weak to remain mounted. His secretary later described finding the emperor unconscious in his litter, clutching his wax tablets where he'd been writing, "Death smiles at us all, smile back." When they finally reached the legionary fortress, soldiers who had served under him for a decade wept openly at his appearance. The philosopher emperor who shared their hardships now looked like a walking corpse animated by pure will. Yet somehow when the Germanic Confederation massed 40,000 warriors for what they believed would be an easy victory against a dying emperor, Marcus transformed. Witnesses described him mounting his horse that morning as if decades had fallen away, his voice carrying across the assembled legions with unexpected power. "They think Rome dies with me. Show them that Rome is not one man, but an idea that outlives any man." The battle that followed was less military genius than desperate savagery. Marcus couldn't physically fight, but he remained visible on a hill, a purple-cloaked skeleton that refused to retreat even when Germanic cavalry broke through and came within arrow range. The victory was absolute. The Maramomani kings surrendered unconditionally. The Quadi agreed to provide hostages. The Arza ceded territory they'd held for centuries, but the cost to Marcus was evident that evening when he had to be carried to the negotiation tent, too weak to walk. He conducted the entire peace conference lying on a couch, occasionally pausing to spit blood into a bronze bowl. The Germanic chiefs, expecting to negotiate with a dying weakling, instead faced a man who seemed to be concentrating his entire remaining life force into these final hours of diplomacy. His meditations from these last months are almost unbearably poignant. The handwriting, once precise, now wavered like a child's. "The universe is transformation. Life is opinion. I transform into earth soon. My opinion is that I have done enough." Another entry barely legible. Strange to think this hand that writes will soon be dust. Stranger still that these thoughts will outlive the hand. Strangest of all, that neither hand nor thought finally matters. The longest entry from this period seems written during a night of particular agony. Pain is fascinating when you know it will end soon. Either it will stop or you will. Either way, liberation. Commodus will destroy everything I've built. This too is nature. Lions produce lions. Philosophers produce disappointments. His last military council was held in February 110. Too weak to sit upright, Marcus lay on his side, detailing which legions should remain on the frontier, which tribes could be trusted, which required watching. His generals took notes knowing these instructions would be ignored the moment Commodus took power. When Pompeianus suggested Marcus name a different heir, the emperor smiled with cracked lips. That would mean civil war. Better one bad emperor than 50,000 dead Romans fighting over who should be good emperor. He had perhaps days left. But there was still one last duty, the impossible task of preparing his son for an empire he was destined to ruin. Marcus Aurelius spent his last week of coherent consciousness watching his son practice sword fighting with Syrian slaves he'd had painted gold to look like statues. And when Commodus beheaded one with a particularly theatrical flourish, the dying emperor closed his eyes and whispered to his secretary, "Make a list of the empire's best administrators. He'll need them until he kills them." The final attempt to salvage Commodus began on March 10th, 180, when Marcus summoned enough strength for one last sustained conversation with his son. Witnesses outside the tent heard the emperor's voice, weak but urgent, interrupted occasionally by Commodus's bored responses. "Power is not a prize," Marcus said. "It's a burden that breaks everyone who carries it." Commodus replied, "It hasn't broken me, father. I find it quite enjoyable." The silence that followed lasted so long that guards nearly entered to check if Marcus had died. What followed was Marcus's desperate attempt to create an administrative cage around his son's worst impulses. He appointed Claudius Pompeianus, his most trusted general and son-in-law, a senior military advisor. Cyaterus, Commodus' childhood friend but a competent administrator, was named chamberlain. Paternus, the Praetorian prefect, who had served loyally for a decade, would control the palace guard. The message was clear. Commodus would rule, but experienced hands would govern. Marcus even extracted oaths from these men, made them swear on their children's lives to guide and restrain his son. The tragedy was that Commodus understood exactly what his father was doing. "You're building me a prison of advisors," he told Marcus during one of their final meetings. "You think I'm too stupid to rule alone?" Marcus, too exhausted for diplomatic lies, responded, "Not stupid, untested. These men have governed while you've played at being a gladiator. Use them until you learn." Commodus smiled the way he did when watching animals die in the arena. "Or I could just kill them and appoint men who appreciate their emperor." Marcus tried philosophy as a last resort, knowing it was futile. He had Commodus sit through readings of his own meditations, hoping something might penetrate. The scene was surreal. The dying philosopher emperor having his private thoughts read to a son who spent the sessions drawing pictures of himself as Hercules. When they reached the passage, "What brings no benefit to the hive brings none to the bee," Commodus interrupted. "But what if the bee wants to be a wasp? What if the hive is boring?" Marcus stared at his son for a long moment, then said, "Then the bee dies alone, and the hive continues without it." The most pathetic moment came when Marcus attempted to teach Commodus basic economic policy. The empire was still bleeding money from the wars, requiring careful management of resources. Marcus explained the necessity of maintaining reserve funds, of balancing military spending with infrastructure, of the delicate relationship between taxation and rebellion. Commodus listened with apparent attention, then asked, "But if we need money, why don't we just take it from the senators? They're all rich, and there are only about 600 of them." The question revealed such fundamental ignorance of how the empire functioned that Marcus couldn't formulate a response. On March 15th, Marcus made his last public appearance too weak to stand, but insisting on being carried to the Principia, where the eagles of the legions were kept. Before assembled officers, he formally confirmed Commodus as his sole heir and successor. His speech, recorded by military scribes, was heartbreaking in its forced optimism. "My son has youth, energy, and the love of Rome's armies. Guide him as you've guided me." Everyone present knew it was a lie. Commodus had already promised the troops massive donatives, essentially bribes, the moment his father died, money the empire didn't have. That night, Marcus called for his philosophical text one last time, not to read, but to give away. he distributed his precious scrolls among literate officers and administrators, keeping only a single small volume of Epictetus. To Commodus, he left his personal copy of Plato's Republic inscribed, "What we wish to be and what we must be are rarely the same. Choose wisely." Commodus would later use the book as a doorstop for his favourite concubine's chambers. The emperor, who had spent 19 years trying to create a philosophical heir, was forced to accept the cruelest truth. Some people cannot be saved, especially by those who love them most. At dawn on March the 17th, 180, Marcus Aurelius asked his physician for the position of the sun, and when told it was rising, he said, "Then I should be setting," turned his face to the tent wall and began the deliberate process of dying like a philosopher. The end had been coming for hours. Through the night, his breathing had grown so laboured that it sounded like wind through a broken gate. The physician, Galen's student Pythilus, had offered one final dose of poppy juice for the pain. Marcus refused. "I've spent my life trying to see clearly. I won't die in a fog." The rejection meant agony. Witnesses described him gripping the bed frame so hard that his fingernails tore, blood seeping between his fingers, but it also meant consciousness for what he considered philosophy's ultimate test, meeting death with dignity. The imperial tent at Vindobona was crowded but silent. Commodus stood near the entrance, already wearing purple, though his father still breathed. The generals formed a semicircle, some openly weeping. These hardened killers, who had watched thousands die, were broken by the slow extinguishing of one frail philosopher. The Taurian prefect held the imperial seal waiting. Everyone was waiting. Death, it seemed, was taking its time with Marcus Aurelius, as if even mortality respected the man enough to let him prepare. He called for his secretary one last time, not for grand final words, but for administrative detail. The watchword for tomorrow should be equanimitas. Equanimity. Even dying, he was thinking about the next morning's military routine. Then he asked each person present to approach individually to Pompeianus. Remember that ruling and surviving are different skills. Help him with the first until he fails at the second. To the physician, no preservation of the body after death. Burn it here. The ashes can go anywhere. Rome has better uses for marble than housing my bones. When Commodus finally approached, Marcus studied his son's face for a long moment. Last words between father and son were reported differently by different witnesses. Some claimed Marcus said, "Be better than I fear you are." Others heard, "Try to be good." The most reliable account from the secretary standing closest suggests Marcus simply said, "I tried," though whether he meant trying to rule well or trying to raise his son properly remains ambiguous. As afternoon faded to evening, Marcus's speech became intermittent, mixing Greek and Latin, philosophy and memory. He recited passages from Epictetus, then called for his dead children by name. He asked for Faustina, forgetting she had died years earlier. At one point he seemed to be conducting a military briefing from decades past, warning about Parthian cavalry movements. These weren't the ravings of delirium, but the mind sorting through 60 years of experience, filing away the last thoughts before the great library of consciousness closed forever. The actual moment came at sunset. The captain of the guard entered for the evening password, the last official act of Marcus's reign. The emperor struggled to focus, then spoke his final coherent words. "Go to the rising sun. I am already setting." He gestured weakly toward Commodus. The meaning was clear. The transfer of power was complete. The captain saluted, tears streaming into his beard, and turned to Commodus for the new password. "Hercules Romanus," Commodus said, already reimagining himself as a god. Marcus's breathing grew shallower. His eyes, which had stayed focused despite everything, gradually lost their connection to the present. Witnesses said he seemed to be looking at something beyond the tent walls, beyond Vindobona, beyond the empire itself. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. Then, with the simplicity that had defined his philosophy, Marcus Aurelius stopped. No dramatic last breath, no death rattle. He simply ceased like a lamp running out of oil. Commodus waited exactly long enough to ensure his father was dead, then walked out to address the legions. Within an hour, he had promised them bonuses that would bankrupt the treasury. Within 3 hours, he had countermanded most of Marcus's final orders. The philosopher emperor's body wasn't even cold before his life's work began to crumble. But in that tent, in those first moments after Marcus died, something else happened that the histories barely mention. Before Marcus Aurelius's funeral pea had even cooled to ash, Commodus stood before the assembled legions and announced, "My divine father's war is over. We march for Rome tomorrow, where I will show you what it means when an emperor truly loves his people." The abandonment was breathtaking in its speed and completeness. Marcus had spent 12 years securing the Danube frontier, bleeding for every mile of Germanic territory, carefully settling barbarian tribes in a complex system of alliances. Within 72 hours of his death, Commodus had offered the Marmani Quadi and Yassigs whatever terms they wanted in exchange for immediate peace. The Germanic chiefs, who had expected years of careful negotiation, found themselves offered more than they had dreamed of demanding. Gold, weapons, even the return of hostages Marcus had taken. Commodus gave it all away like a man desperate to flee a plague house. The Roman generals watched in horror as their emperor dismantled everything. Pompeianus tried to explain that the settlements Marcus had negotiated were delicate structures requiring constant maintenance. Commodus responded by removing him from command. "My father loved complexity because he loved suffering. I prefer simplicity. They want gold. Give them gold. They want us gone. We go." When another general protested that this would invite future invasions, Commodus had him transferred to Britain as far from influence as possible. The march back to Rome became a travelling festival of excess. While Marcus had shared his soldiers' rations, Commodus brought a personal chef who prepared peacock tongues and flamingo brains. While Marcus had slept in a standard command tent, Commodus had a portable palace constructed complete with heated floors and a collapsible marble bath. He stopped at every major city to hold games, spending the treasury Marcus had so carefully guarded on gladiator shows and wild beast hunts. In Aquileia alone, he spent 1,000,000 Caiuses on a 3-day festival, celebrating his victory over the Germans, a victory he had achieved by surrendering everything his father had fought for. Rome received him like a conquering hero. The masses, exhausted by decades of war, cheered an emperor who promised them entertainment instead of duty. Commodus's first act was to declare 135 consecutive days of games, the longest in Roman history. He distributed gold to the urban masses with such profligacy that inflation doubled within months. When advisers warned him the treasury was emptying, he laughed. "Then we'll squeeze the provinces. There's always more gold somewhere." The systematic destruction of Marcus's legacy was surgical in its precision. The philosophical advisers were dismissed and replaced with gladiators and charioteers. The careful diplomatic relationships with client kings were allowed to rot. The settlements of Germanic tribes that Marcus had integrated were revoked, creating tens of thousands of suddenly dispossessed and furious barbarians on the frontier. The economic reforms were reversed. The military discipline was relaxed to the point of collapse. Soldiers were allowed to wear jewellery and live with wives in camp, destroying the professional culture Marcus had maintained through personal example. Most grotesque was Commodus' treatment of his father's memory. He had Marcus deified, but only to emphasise his own divinity by association. he renamed all 12 months after himself: Lucius, Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, Augustus, Hercules, Romanus, Exuperatorius, Amazonius, Invictus, Felix and Pius. He declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules and appeared in the Senate dressed in a lion skin carrying a club. He fought as a gladiator in fixed matches, charging the treasury 1,000,000 sisters per appearance for the privilege of watching the emperor pretend to risk his life. Within a year, everything Marcus had written about was inverted. Where Marcus preached duty, Commodus embodied pleasure. Where Marcus sought wisdom, Commodus celebrated ignorance. Where Marcus built careful structures to outlast him, Commodus tore them down for immediate gratification. One senator, writing secretly to a friend in Athens, captured the mood. It's as if we buried philosophy itself with Marcus. What rules now has no name in Greek or Latin. It's simply appetite wearing purple. The empire that Marcus had held together through will and wisdom was transforming into something he would have considered worse than destruction, a parody of itself ruled by his own blood. Yet even as Rome descended into farce, something unexpected was happening to those strange notebooks Marcus had written in his tent. The secretary who saved Marcus Aurelius's wax tablets from the fire was a Greek slave named Crispus, who defied direct orders from Commodus to burn all his father's boring philosophy, wrapping the notebooks in oiled cloth and hiding them in a grain shipment to Athens, never knowing he had just rescued the future consolation of humanity. For nearly a century, the 12 books of Marcus's private thoughts circulated quietly among philosophical schools, copied by students who found in them something unprecedented. Not a treatise arguing for Stoicism, but the raw evidence of a human being actually living it, while carrying impossible burdens. The earliest known reference comes from a letter in 3 to 12, where a Christian bishop in Syria mentions the emperor who wrote to himself about God, suggesting the texts had travelled far beyond their intended obscurity. But it was in Constantinople, that great preservation chamber of ancient wisdom, where Byzantine scholars in the 10th century gave Marcus's notebooks their enduring title, Tes Hamilton, to himself, lateral Latinized as Meditations. The history that followed reads like destiny wearing the mask of coincidence. In 1453, as Constantinople fell to Ottoman cannons, a Byzantine scholar named Basarion fled west carrying a single manuscript. Marcus's Meditations tucked between Christian texts to avoid destruction. That copy reached the Vatican Library, where in 1558 a German Protestant named Wilhelm Zelander found it, translated it into Latin, and published it in Zurich with a dedication claiming Marcus Aurelius was more Christian than most Christians. The paradox of a pagan emperor who had persecuted believers becoming moral instruction for the faithful was lost on no one. Yet the words transcended their contradictions. But the true immortality of Marcus's thoughts began in blood and terror. During the 30 Years' War, Swedish King Gustavus Adolphus carried the Meditations into every battle, reading passages before combat. When he died at Luton in 1632, the book was found in his saddlebag, bookmarked at "Consider that everything is opinion, and opinion is in thy power." Frederick the Great of Prussia slept with it under his pillow during the 7 Years' War, annotating his copy with margins noting. This Roman understands what kings pretend to forget. The American founding fathers passed copies among themselves. Thomas Jefferson called it a monument to the human capacity for dignity without divinity. The words found their way into impossible places. Admiral James Stockdale, shot down over Vietnam and tortured for 7 years in the Hanoi Hilton, later testified that Marcus's phrase, "What stands in the way becomes the way," was the only thing that kept him sane during 2 years in legions. Viktor Frankl in Auschwitz would silently recite from memory, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you'll find strength. teaching it to fellow prisoners as a survival technique. Nelson Mandela, during 27 years on Robben Island, kept a smuggled copy hidden in his cell. The pages so worn from handling that entire passages had to be rewritten from memory. Modern neuroscientists studying resilience have discovered that Marcus's techniques, negative visualization, cognitive reframing, the view from above, actually alter brain chemistry in measurable ways, reducing cortisol and increasing prefrontal cortex activity. The emperor, who knew nothing of neurons, had intuited pathways to psychological survival that laboratories would take 2 millennia to confirm. Corporate executives pay thousands for workshops teaching Stoic leadership principles that Marcus recorded for free on wax tablets. Athletes memorize his passages about persistent effort. Therapists prescribe his exercises for accepting what cannot be changed, yet the deepest irony remains. Marcus Aurelius, who considered himself a failure as a father and feared his legacy would die with his son's inevitable ruin, became history's permanent teacher of dignity under pressure. The empire he fought to preserve lasted another 3 centuries before collapsing. The philosophy he wrote to preserve his sanity has lasted 2,000 years and shows no signs of fading. His son Commodus, who renamed months after himself and declared himself a god, is remembered only as a cautionary tale. Marcus, who wanted only to be forgotten, became immortal. In libraries from Tokyo to Sao Paulo, in prison cells and presidential offices, in hospital wards and homeless shelters, a Roman emperor dead for 18 centuries continues teaching the same lesson. We cannot control what happens to us, only how we respond. This is the longest shadow ever cast by a human life, not through conquest, but through 12 small books of private thoughts, never meant for publication, that proved empires of stone last centuries, while empires of wisdom last forever.